Let's take a look at demand pull inflation. A positive demand shock expands the economy beyond full employment output. So when we take a look at all these curves right here, it seems very, very complex, but there is a sort of mechanism and channel that we're going to detail step by step in order to see how we move from point E to point A to say point B right here in terms of our new macroeconomic equilibrium. So we transition from the short run over to the long run based on everything that we've built up so far. So demand pull inflation is pretty much one of the reasons why we can't have sort of good economic times all the time, because we are going to adjust our expectations, and we'll see exactly how that all comes out to play. So let's go ahead and take a look at demand pull inflation. Demand pull inflation. So demand pull inflation is going to say it's going to lead to inflation in the long run, but this is going to result when the aggregate demand expands so much. So results when aggregate demand expands so much that equilibrium output exceeds full employment output and the price level rises. So once again, demand pull inflation is going to result when aggregate demand expands so much that equilibrium output exceeds full employment output and the price level rises. The easiest way to differentiate demand pull inflation and cost push inflation, which we're going to take a look at next, is that under demand pull inflation, there is a positive demand shift that happens first. So a positive demand shift happens first. So if there's a positive demand shock that happens, doesn't really matter what that shock is going to be. As long as it happens first, we know that we're going to be working under demand pull inflation. So let's go ahead and see exactly what this looks like graphically and the mechanisms and channels under it. First, we draw out our graph. We have price level, we have output, and in both of these cases, we're going to start off in long run equilibrium. So here we have LRAS, we have SRAS 0, and AD 0. So here at point A, we have price level 0, PL 0, and output level Q star. So everything is really happy under our sort of happy little place because we are in long run equilibrium. So just starting off initially, we do notice that the economy is going to be operating in long run equilibrium. So here, starting off point, economy is operating in long run equilibrium. So here, point A. Nothing new with this. This is typically going to be our starting point no matter what. But now let's go ahead and introduce the circumstances of demand pull inflation. So here we have a positive demand shock that happens. So positive demand shock. And this could be due to, say, government spending increasing, consumer confidence increasing, stock prices rising, investment increasing. Doesn't really matter what shock happens as long as aggregate demand is going to increase. So aggregate demand is going to increase, and we want to go ahead and draw this out. So when aggregate demand increases, we shift our aggregate demand curve over to the right, away from the origin. So draw as such, and we end up at AD1 here. So at AD1, our new intersection of AD1 and SRAS 0 is going to be at point B right here. And at point B, what do we notice? We notice that we have higher price levels, there's some type of inflation, and we also notice that, hey, our GDP level is higher than our full employment level. And in the short run, this is perfectly fine. So remember, anytime we're above Q star, the economy is in a boom, so the economy is overheating just a little bit. So here, we're going to be led to short run equilibrium at point B. And of course, this is perfectly fine on a temporary basis. The economy can expand. Beyond full employment. So here, we're still working in the short run, the intersection of AD1, SRAS 0. We are in the short run. It's perfectly fine for us to be above full employment. However, can the situation last forever? And like we said before, this situation cannot last forever. Good times cannot last forever. So what is actually going to be the transition process that pushes us back to our long-run equilibrium? Remember, when we talked about the short-run aggregate supply curve, we talked about the short-run to the long-run transition. So what happens at point B? At point B, we realize that there's higher prices, there's inflation happening within the economy. So what do workers begin to realize? Workers begin to realize that, hey, my wages haven't increased, but the prices have increased, so my purchasing power has gone down, so I'm going to go ahead and demand higher wages. So over time, workers will demand higher wages. Will demand higher wages. And as the workers demand these higher wages and as firms have to grant them to them, it's going to increase the cost of prices of goods because the cost of inputs have also gone up. So here, this increases costs of doing business. So we'll just say, hey, costs and prices of doing business of goods, and essentially doing business because the price of inputs have increased. So cost of inputs rise. And exactly what determinant are we hitting on in this particular section, mechanism right here in this channel? So remember that one of the determinants of SRAS is exactly going to be the cost of inputs. If the cost of inputs go up, that's going to affect the SRAS curve, and that's going to shift our SRAS curve over to the left because it's now gotten more expensive to supply these goods and services. So here, as these costs increase, as workers demand higher wages, as the input costs go up, we notice that we're going to shift our SRAS curve, to the left, and how far are we going to shift it over to the left? We're going to keep on shifting it over to the left until long-run equilibrium is reached. So in this case, it's going to be point C, so we'll draw this out very shortly. It's going to be point C for us. So as we go from point B, where we're still in the short run, and these workers are now demanding higher wages because they notice that price levels have increased, workers are going to be granted these higher wages. Input costs have gone up, so the short-run aggregate supply curve is going to be affected. Firms and corporations aren't going to be able to supply as much as before. So here, we shift our SRAS curve over to the left until we hit our new equilibrium. That's going to be exactly where all three of these curves intersect with one another, exactly at point C. And exactly at point C, what do we realize? We realize that we are now in both short-run and long-run equilibrium, but we notice that, hey, prices have gotten higher as a result from this entire process. So PL2 right here. We have higher prices, but the same amount of GDP as before. So the final conclusion, or the final sort of thing that we want to note, is what happens in our macroeconomic equilibrium. We notice that the price level increases, but we remain at remain at full employment GDP. So here, this is taking a look at the entire transition process of demand pull inflation as we move from point A to point B to point C. So once again, we'll just do a very, very quick review just so it gets in the back of your mind of exactly what's happening here. At point A, we are working in short and long run equilibrium. This is our initial starting off point. We have full employment GDP, we have price level 0. But there's going to be some type of positive aggregate demand shock or some type of positive demand shock. It can be something dealing with consumption, investment, government spending, or net exports. It just shifts our aggregate demand further or beyond our full employment output. And that's where we hit point B in the short run. And in the short run at point B, we notice that we have higher prices and also a higher amount of GDP in the short run. And that's perfectly fine. However, this situation cannot last forever because workers begin to realize that prices have gone up. There is some type of inflation happening within the economy. So their purchasing power has gone down. So they go straight to their boss, go to their employers and say, hey, I need a higher wage. you need to give me a raise or else I can't work. And basically the firms and corporations are going to be granting them the higher wages. Wages are seen as an input cost, and as input costs go up, we notice that SRAS is going to be affected, and we shift the SRAS curve over to the left, and we end up in long-run equilibrium at PL2 at point C right here with price level PL2 and quantity Q star in this case. So here, this is just taking a look at exactly the entire transition of demand pull inflation as we go from our initial point all the way to our new equilibrium, to our short run equilibrium, to our long run equilibrium, from A to B to C. So with all of this in mind, there can be a few good applications of this demand pull inflation. We actually have two pretty good ones right here. We take a look at the United States in the 1960s. So the Vietnam conflict expanded aggregate demand and induced inflation as the economy approached full employment in 1969. We can see this graphically. And also more notably in Japan from 1985 to 1995, where they enjoyed a huge trade surplus, which expanded the economy. And they wanted to keep on expanding the economy, so they kept interest rates artificially low, which fueled a real estate and stock bubble, which escalated the inflation rate and essentially led to the lost decade. And they still, I don't believe, have fully recovered from that. It was just a sort of very bad time for Japan after 1995. And graphically, we can see exactly what's happening here. So in the United States, as we increase aggregate demand, as we get closer and closer to full employment GDP, the only thing that's going to result is higher prices or inflation. In Japan, we notice the same sort of result. As aggregate demand keeps on increasing, it just keeps on increasing the inflation rate. So essentially, with demand pull inflation, it's one of the primary reasons why we cannot keep on increasing spending through any of our spending components in order to keep the economy at a very high GDP level. Because we as consumers and workers are going to start to realize that this situation cannot last forever. We're going to ask for higher wages and for raises, and essentially that's going to lead to just only higher prices in the future. So something to keep in mind, we're going to see this sort of impact in government spending when we take a look at fiscal policy in chapter number 10. So also one of the primary reasons why the government cannot keep on spending trillions and trillions of dollars year after year after year, because it's only going to lead to higher inflation rates in the future. We'll go ahead, finish up the rest of the chapter by taking a look at our second case of inflation with cost push inflation next. I'll see you guys there.